And he would always tell Zeppelin, I'm leaving the band. I can't go back to America again. I can't do all that.
When Ritchie Blackmore speaks his mind, the rock world tends to listen, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with outrage. One of his most infamous remarks came when he turned his fire toward none other than the Rolling Stones, dismissing them bluntly as idiots. Reporter notes from his interviews revealed that Blackmore never understood why a band he viewed as technically limited became the face of an entire generation. To him, their riffs were repetitive, their musicianship sloppy, and their success more about charisma and image than genuine skill. In Blackmore's eyes, originality and discipline mattered above everything, and he felt the Stones had neither. Industry insiders often remarked that his disdain wasn't just casual criticism, it was part of a larger frustration with the way rock music rewarded spectacle over substance. By labeling the Stones in such harsh terms, Blackmore was taking a direct shot at the establishment of mainstream rock itself, questioning whether the giants of the genre deserved their thrones. Fans were divided. Some agreed with his brutal honesty, while others accused him of bitterness. Yet the comment stuck, carving its place in the long list of Ritchie Blackmore's unfiltered outbursts. And if he was this merciless toward the Rolling Stones, the question was obvious. Who else made his personal blacklist? Behind Ritchie Blackmore's most controversial statements lies a core philosophy that shaped his entire career. Originality is sacred, repetition is unforgivable. Reporter archives of his interviews highlight how he often dismissed popular rock as little more than recycled riff dressed up with swagger. To Blackmore, a true guitarist wasn't someone who could play loud or fast, but someone who could invent, surprise, and breathe new life into every performance. This obsession with originality came from his own classical training. He admired precision, structure, and creativity drawn from centuries-old traditions, not the copy-and-paste approach he accused many rock stars of using. Blackmore would bristle when hearing songs that sounded too familiar, once quipping that some hit tracks were basically the same 3 chords on repeat, sold in a different hairstyle. Industry insiders noted that this wasn't just personal taste, it was the lens through which he judged his peers. If a guitarist relied too heavily on cliches, in Blackmore's mind, they were committing a musical crime. Fans who adored his boundary-pushing solos often celebrated this tough stance, but it also left him isolated from the mainstream crowd, where familiarity was often the key to success. In his world, being hated for honesty was better than being loved for imitation. But holding this philosophy so tightly also meant that clashes with fellow guitar heroes were inevitable, and some of those clashes turned into legendary feuds. When Ritchie Blackmore dropped hints about disliking certain guitarists, the rock community buzzed with speculation. Who exactly was on his hate list? Reporter coverage from over the decades shows that while he rarely spelled out every name, his biting comments painted a clear picture of the type of players who rubbed him the wrong way. Blackmore seemed to have little patience for guitarists he saw as more style than substance, a category that many believed included some of his own contemporaries. Industry chatter often pointed toward Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and even Jeff Beck as possible targets of his critiques. Not because he denied their talent, but because he felt their fame sometimes outweighed their originality. Blackmore once implied that Clapton's blues style was predictable, that Page relied too much on riffs recycled from the past, and that Beck was too concerned with flash. While none of these accusations were ever codified in a single list, fans and journalists pieced together the clues like a puzzle, trying to identify the 8 names he allegedly couldn't stand. What made the guessing game more fascinating was how Blackmore himself seemed to enjoy keeping people in suspense, dropping barbed remarks but never confirming the full roster. The mystery fueled debates in magazines, fan forums, and late-night radio shows, where audiences argued endlessly over who belonged in that circle of disdain. And as reporters noted, the speculation wasn't just gossip. It revealed how deeply Blackmore's high standards clashed with the very legends he once shared stages with. But the tension didn't stop at whispers. Some of these rivalries with rock icons became public enough to shape his reputation forever. Few stories in rock journalism capture attention like the quiet wars between guitar heroes, and Ritchie Blackmore was often at the center of them. Reporter accounts from the golden age of rock reveal that his relationship with fellow icons like Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck was defined as much by rivalry as by respect. Blackmore openly questioned Clapton's reputation, suggesting that while Clapton was worshipped as a blues purist, he lacked the adventurous streak needed to truly innovate. With Jimmy Page, the tension came from comparisons. fans and critics constantly pitted Deep Purple against Led Zeppelin, fueling Blackmore's irritation that Page was celebrated for riffs Blackmore saw as derivative. Even Jeff Beck, a guitarist whose technical brilliance was undeniable, wasn't spared. Blackmore admired Beck's skill, but felt his flamboyant style leaned too much on gimmicks. Behind the scenes, insiders describe Blackmore as a man unwilling to join the old boys club of British guitar royalty. He preferred to stand apart, critiquing rather than collaborating. These clashes weren't screaming matches or public brawls. They were sharp comments in interviews, frosty silences backstage, and subtle digs that reporters quickly picked up on. Fans often debated whether Blackmore's criticisms came from jealousy or uncompromising standards, but one thing was clear: he wasn't afraid to challenge the legends. And in a world where rock icons often traded compliments for diplomacy, Blackmore's candor was both shocking and refreshing. Yet his bluntness came with a cost, as it strained relationships and shaped his reputation as one of rock's most difficult personalities. Still, that defiance became part of his legend, and the consequences of speaking so freely would follow him for decades. Ritchie Blackmore's sharp tongue didn't just create headlines, it left a trail of consequences that reporters documented across his career. By speaking so bluntly about fellow musicians, he carved out a reputation as both fearless and difficult, a man who valued honesty more than harmony. Industry insiders admitted that some opportunities slipped through his fingers because of this. Certain collaborations never happened, tours were tense, and relationships with other guitarists often remained strained. While fans admired his willingness to say what others wouldn't, record executives and promoters sometimes saw him as a risk, someone who could turn a press conference into a controversy with just one remark. Fellow musicians, too, often kept him at arm's length, wary of becoming the next target of his criticisms. Reporters noted that this outspokenness isolated Blackmore in a scene where diplomacy usually kept careers alive. Yet paradoxically, it also elevated him. By refusing to play along with industry politics, he became a symbol of authenticity, an artist who answered only to his own standards. Some critics framed him as bitter, but others argued he was simply brave enough to say out loud what many quietly thought. The toll was clear. Blackmore walked a lonelier path than many of his peers. But that solitude also gave him the freedom to pursue music on his own terms, whether it was driving Deep Purple to new heights or reinventing himself later with Renaissance-inspired projects. His voice may have cost him allies, but it also cemented his status as one of rock's most uncompromising figures. And while the personal cost was heavy, the ripple effects of his candor reshaped how guitarists approached their craft in the years to come. Ritchie Blackmore's blunt criticism didn't just ruffle feathers, it sent shockwaves through the entire guitar community. Reporter notes from across the decades highlight how younger players were both intimidated and inspired by his uncompromising standards. On one hand, his harsh words about unoriginal riffs and lazy musicianship raised the bar, forcing ambitious guitarists to dig deeper into creativity rather than settle for cliches. Many admitted privately that they practiced harder after hearing Blackmore turn to the so-called legends, worried they might be next in his firing line. On the other hand, his relentless judgment created a culture of fear, where some musicians felt they could never live up to his expectations. Industry analysts argued that this dual effect shaped the guitar scene for years. It discouraged mediocrity, but also alienated those who valued expression over technicality. Critics suggested that without Blackmore's harsh spotlight, the rock world might have grown complacent, too comfortable recycling old formulas. Instead, his voice, though divisive, acted like a disruptive force, shaking the scene and keeping innovation alive. Fans, too, played their part, amplifying his remarks into debates about what real guitar playing should be. The consequence was clear. Whether loved or hated, Blackmore's words carried weight, shaping not only his legacy but also the trajectory of rock itself. And as he reached his 80s, those consequences became even more fascinating, raising the ultimate question: was his hate genuine hostility, or was it his way of protecting the integrity of the craft he devoted his life to? As Ritchie Blackmore reaches the age of 80, his legacy is defined not only by the blazing riffs of Deep Purple and Rainbow, but also by the enemies, or at least rivals, he made along the way. Reporters who followed his career for decades emphasized that when Blackmore used the word hate, it often sounded less like personal hostility and more like his uncompromising filter for judging music. To him, guitarists who recycled riffs, relied on image, or chased commercial trends betrayed the essence of artistry, and he was unafraid to call them out. From labeling the Rolling Stones idiots to throwing subtle jabs at Clapton, Page, and Beck, he built a reputation as the unfiltered critic of rock's biggest names. The cost was isolation and controversy, but the benefit was a career defined by fearless originality. Fans remain split. Some see him as bitter, others as brutally honest, but almost everyone agrees that his voice, sharp as his playing, forced the rock world to look in the mirror. The ultimate takeaway? Blackmore's so-called hate list wasn't about grudges. It was about guarding the standards of a craft he treated as sacred. And whether you agree with him or not, one thing is certain. Few guitarists have shaped the conversation around rock music with such unflinching candor. Perhaps the real question isn't who Blackmore hated, but whether rock would have pushed itself as far without his relentless demand for originality.